Let's continue reading here on page 83. Middle of the page, paragraph, if I put this in the foreground, it is because analysis strongly emphasizes that this is one of the essential problems. Never forget that nothing touching on the behavior of the human being as subject, human being as subject meaning subject to the symbolic, or on anything in which he realizes himself, in which he quite simply is, can escape being bound by the laws of speech. That's what it feels like for the neurotic or the typical person to emerge. They feel bound by the laws of speech. Laws of speech that were not of their own making. Why do I say that? Because the language atop which you speak was not created when you were born. It predates you. It is not your language. We oftentimes refer to it as the mother tongue. Why? Because it ain't yours. It was your mother's tongue before it became yours. You are bound by these laws of speech. You are bound by a code of conduct, laws of speech, rules of engagement that are not of your own creation. You have to simply situate yourself within, or at least in relation to, those rules. Even a rejection of those rules is a primitive affirmation that they exist, a bejahung in its own right. That's what we're getting at here. You may disagree with how society places human beings. Most of us do. But in order to disagree with established norms of placement for human beings, there's a primitive affirmation that comes with that disagreement. You have to affirm that that system of placements exists in order to take it on. There's a primitive affirmation that is logically prior to any disagreement with those norms. I say logically prior because it's not like you sit down and say, okay, let's start with a basic agreement here. We all agree that this is an established protocol, blah, 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 blah. Not usually. Usually we just say, I've had it. I've had enough. I'm tired of this. This isn't working for me, blah, blah, blah. In order to have that disagreement, you have to first have some sort of a recognition, an affirmation of sorts, of the system against which you are railing. And oftentimes, in disagreements, this will come up. People will say, wait, what are you actually arguing against here? What are you actually upset about? I'm upset about the fact that you did blah, 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 blah. And they'll say, don't make assumptions. I didn't do that. That wasn't me. You say, oh, I thought we had already agreed that that was your dish that had been in the sink, and that's why I'm upset. I'm sorry, no, that wasn't my dish. That dish was when your mom visited and she left that in there. You didn't make it and I didn't make it either, so don't blame me. Now suddenly you've gone back to that presumption, that primitive bejahung, and called it into question, which is a very good way to do something called critique. It's the basic model of critical thought, is to ask, what are the presuppositions, the presumptions, the assumptions that have to be in place and accepted by all in order for this moment, be it a disagreement or otherwise, to occur. Now, this is a recording, so you can play that back and hear it as many times as you want. But that is the basic move of critique, is to study and, where possible, change the presumptions and the presuppositions that allow any particular moment to appear as it does. Reading on, page 83. Toward the bottom, if Freud insisted on the Oedipus complex, to the extent of constructing a sociology of totems and taboos, it is obviously because for him, the law with a capital L is there ab origine. It is there out of the question. It is therefore out of the question to ask oneself the question of origins. The law is there precisely from the beginning. It has always been there. And human sexuality must realize itself through it and by means of it. The law is simply the law of symbolization. This is what the Oedipus complex means. Here again, Lacan is working what is one of the most basic lines of thought for him, but that for many of us is very difficult to understand. It's the difference between logical time and temporal time. Logical time is what he's working on here. The law has always been there. So if you want to ask yourself the question of origins, he says it's out of the question to ask oneself the question of origins. Even in order to begin the questioning process, you have to presuppose that there's already a language in place, because otherwise, how would you articulate your question? That's one way to get at this logical priority here. The law is precisely from the beginning, but it's only after you've been integrated into the law that you can look back and notice its primitive existence. There's a kind of retroactivity or retrospection that comes with the symbolic. You're always already in it by the time you start wondering about it. The proof that it exists is logically prior to you is there as soon as you start questioning it. Is another way to think about this. So we're sticking with the neurotic. We're working through this stuff. And Lacan is again talking about the symbolic as a way of situating people. In this case, sex, gender. Like it or not, there is an order out there that tries to corral you into it. This produces something that Lacan on page 84 calls Verdrängung, which is the German word for repression. Repression is the basic mechanism that goes on for neurotic or typical people. This is important here. There's Bejahung, the primitive affirmation or acceptance of the symbolic order, which allows for a kind of negation, Verneinung. In this case, it would be a negation of the world that existed before you accepted the symbolic. And now we get to a third mechanism, very central, known as Verdrängung, repression. Let's read and see what we can learn about this. Repression is not the law of misunderstanding. It is what happens when things don't hang together at the level of a symbolic chain. Each symbolic chain we are linked to comprises an internal coherence, which means that we can be forced at any given moment to render what we have received to someone else. Now, it sometimes happens that we are unable to do this on all levels at once. In other words, we find the law intolerable. Not that it is intolerable in itself, but the position we are in comprises a sacrifice that proves to be impossible at the level of meaning. In other words, the law, the symbolic, society, asks us to situate ourselves in a position that we find intolerable, unacceptable, unable to process. It's not that the law is intolerable, it's the position that the law puts us in that we find intolerable. But the position we are in comprises a sacrifice that proves to be impossible at the level of meaning. Impossible for us to relay to others, to signal to others. In other words, we are no longer able to render what we have received to someone else. These are moments that might leave you speechless. So we repress some of our own acts, discourse, or behavior, things you're ashamed of. Everybody watching this video can imagine and recall moments in your past, sometimes in your childhood, that you are not proud of and that you do not like to think about because you found them intolerable. These are experiences that you don't just go around telling people. These are your deepest, darkest secrets. They are impossible at the level of meaning, first and foremost because you don't like talking about them. The really impossible ones are the ones that you can't even remember because they were so difficult at the time to experience and have been so difficult to ever even call to mind that they've undergone repression. We repress some of our own acts, discourses, and behavior. We negate them to the point of trying to forget them. But the chain nevertheless continues to run on beneath the surface, express its demands, and assert its claims. And it does this through the intermediary of the neurotic symptom. This is where repression is at the base of neurosis. So the experience that you had, that you don't like talking about, that was so bad, in fact, that you can't even remember having it, so bad that it only comes to you in a series of recurring nightmares, so bad that it only comes to you in moments when you try to say Pittsburgh but instead say something else that sounds like pit but refers instead to the anatomy of the woman. Something like this. This runs on beneath the surface. It expresses its demands and it asserts its claims. And it does so at the level of a symptom. When you mean to say Pittsburgh but instead say Titsburg, we hear that as a symptomatic expression of some underlying repressed attitude towards, femininity, towards female anatomy, maybe masculine anatomy, maybe barnyard anatomy. I don't know what the anatomy would be here. But tit refers to a part of the human body that in the case of normative society, women bodies are usually covering up their tits, and so on and so forth. And so it becomes a site of taboo. So much so that when you were growing up, when you were weaned, let's say, you may have experienced that as very traumatic. Suddenly, where you used to go for comfort on your primary caregiver when you nursed, now becomes X'd out. You can't go there. No admittance. Do not enter. That may have been a very traumatic event for you. And as a result, the word tit has always been one that when it comes up makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. It doesn't mean it stops signifying in your life. It means that when you signify the word tit, you're doing so at the level of a neurotic symptom, accidentally. And it's this accident that points us to the neurotic undercurrent. Let's take one more stab, so to speak, at this notion of the symbolic as it relates to neurosis. We'll pick up there in just a moment.